joining me today on this second video in a three-part series where I'm discussing the items that I felt were necessary to bring with me to Alaska. I know many of you are coming to this channel to watch my weekly vlogs, and I will get back to the vlogs, but right now I'm snowed in on the property, as you can see by this lovely berm that the state has provided me at the end of my drive. So I figured this is a great opportunity to cover some additional subjects that people have asked questions about in the comments down below. A couple of those questions have been, what did you bring with you when you moved, and what should I bring with me when I move? I know Mitchell's in Alaska has covered this subject as well in one of their previous videos. And I'm going to say something that they said also, which is your situation might be different than my situation. So I'm a single person living in a very remote location. I don't have a town close to me where I can go resupply. So think about where you're moving and how close you are to a resupply center, and that might influence your decisions as well. However, I will tell you right now that I've met several people in Alaska that have moved here from the lower 48 and that said they wish they had brought more with them when they moved because they sold off everything to be able to make the move and assumed that they would be able to restock or resupply once they arrived in Alaska, only to find out that the things that they were planning on purchasing here either don't ship to Alaska, aren't sold in stores here, or are so costly that they wish they just brought their original item with them. So that should be taken into your consideration when you're thinking about what to bring with you. If you can purchase it in the lower 48 and you can afford to transport it up here with you when you move, you might want to consider doing so. Now for myself, I came up with just the bare minimum of what I could fit in my Ford Expedition. That meant I didn't have a whole lot of room. I didn't have a tow behind trailer. I'll be bringing up the rest of my things this summer by way of my son. In the meantime, I needed to make sure that I had items that are able to stand the test of time. In the event that my son isn't able to bring up those things for whatever reason, I could not afford to bring up inferior goods. For example, I brought up one small stainless steel pot, and it's a Cuisinart pot, so it's not a cheap product. It was not able to withstand one winter. It has a air chamber gasket on the bottom of it that blew out from the heat, either from the butane stove or from the wood stove, and now that pot essentially is useless because anything I put in it burns so quickly that it ruins the food. As you can see here by my basic kitchen setup, I prefer things that are meant to stand the test of time. Cast iron, such as my skillet, cast iron Dutch ovens, glass, and stainless steel. And if you look at my utensils that I have shown here, you'll notice that they're all one-piece construction. There isn't a plastic handle or a tang that is inserted into the handle. It has as few fail points as possible. And I think that's something that's important to look for as well when you're thinking about your supplies. When possible, you want to look for things that you're not going to have to replace that often.
Hey laddies, this is Kenai. I just wanted to break into this video to talk to you before she catches me. First, Alone works a lot. She has a full-time job, is trying to live remote, and is doing YouTube. This means she sometimes ignores me for 2 to 3 minutes at a time. Even worse, sometimes she runs out of dog biscuits. Can you believe it? Second, many of you are trying to guess what kind of dog I am. I'm Scottish, okay? That's all that matters.
Kenai, what are you doing?
Uh-oh, I hear her coming. Got to go. Bye. Oh, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Did you hear talking? That's weird. One of the other things that you might want to take into consideration is having things that serve multi-purposes. Storage is a premium out here as well. A lot of times the cabins that people are purchasing are very small. 500 square feet is not uncommon in Alaska, and therefore storage space might be an issue for some people. And having things that serve a dual purpose will help you also to minimize the amount of things that you're bringing with you. Angie over at Rutherford Roamings said something the other day in her latest video that really struck a chord with me. She said, use it up, wear it out, make do or do without. And that is a perfect saying for anybody who likes to think practically, because if you have it, you might as well use it. And it doesn't make sense to replenish something if you already have it in your supplies. And for me, that saying came for the food that I brought up with me. I already had a pantry full of dry goods. And while I had limited space in the vehicle, I didn't want to just leave those dry goods behind or donate them to somebody when I knew that I was going to need them here anyhow. So it made sense that for me to use up what I could before I left and then to store the rest of it inside my canning jars so that it took up less space on the vehicle, and I was able then to use it up here in Alaska. And it's something that will take up very little space here in the cabin, but is a necessary item. And one of the things that you don't see here in my basic kitchen setup is my roasters. But the cabin that I bought doesn't have any appliances in it. So I don't have an oven or a stove like a traditional home would. All I have is my wood stove, and it's not a wood cook stove. So I had to improvise. I use my roasters as my oven. I just put them on top of the wood stove and put a baking sheet underneath it. And then I just place whatever I want to cook on top of the baking sheet and let it cook in the oven that way. Or I use my Dutch ovens on top of the wood stove. So again, use it up, wear it out, make do, or do without. Very practical saying. So thanks, Angie. In regards to the dry goods that I brought with me, I did bring up several types of beans and lentils, as I said. Now, I prefer to store my beans dry because I know they'll have a very long shelf life, and I have the availability to let them soak overnight or to do a quick soak on the wood stove when need be. But if you're somebody who likes convenience foods, then maybe look at getting canning supplies, as I have here. You can see I have several types of glass jars, and I have lids and rings for those glass jars, and different ways of canning different items, such as my water bath canner that sits on my wood stove and has my hot water in it that I use for cleaning. But I also have a pressure canner, and I also have ways of dry canning items such as my dry goods. But if you want convenience foods, canning is a great way to turn something that might otherwise take a long time to cook, such as the beans that I mentioned, and have them ready in a moment's notice, such as what Ron over at Alone Off Grid just recently did, where he canned up 42 jars of different types of beans so that when he wants a quick meal, all he has to do is grab a jar out of his pantry. Now, if he didn't have a means of pressure canning, he wouldn't have been able to do that. And pressure canning and water bath canning is a great way of preserving your food for long-term food storage. And when you're living remotely and there's not convenience foods close by, canning is an essential part of life, and such as fermenting and dehydrating. Now, you could go out and spend a lot of money on a dehydrator. You could even fashion a solar dehydrator. For me, I'm able to dehydrate over my wood stove by putting something on a rack high up above the heat source and just letting that convection heat and the air movement dry out the items. And then I just store those in glass jars as well. So think about that. Think about things that are practical. Think about things that have longevity to them, that are easily repairable, and that are sustainable to the life that you plan on living. Now, I know a lot of people, when they think sustainable, they have different ways of sustaining themselves. For some, that means being close to a grocery store so that they can get the supplies that they need when they need them. I'm not in an area where there's a grocery store that is conveniently located to me. And so I brought up my vegetable seeds knowing that I would need to start a garden here this summer. I also did bring up with me my potatoes that I grew in my garden in Colorado. Now, the potatoes that I grew in Colorado, I pulled them up a little bit early, so they're a little bit small, but they store in a cardboard box sheltered from light and heat underneath my bed, which happens to be positioned in a place in the cabin that is the furthest away from the heat source. Now, I wasn't able to bring all the crops with me that I needed to carry me through the winter. So I did purchase several fresh fruits and vegetables such as carrots and beets and apples. Those things are also stored underneath the bed. The carrots and the beets are stored in 50 pounds each of moist sand. I will still have carrots available, fresh carrots, while my other carrots are growing in the ground this summer. My apples, as you can see, I just store them similar to the potatoes in a closed cardboard box. And yes, they're getting a little soft now, but it's been 6 months that they've been stored like this, and they're perfectly edible. If I wanted to eat these apples, I could, but because they are at that point where they're starting to lose their crispness, they're great for baking. They'll make a delicious pie. And maybe I'll do an apple crisp again so I can provide you the actual recipe. And remember, if you're not subscribed, please do, and turn on bell notifications, and that way you'll get notified when I do publish a recipe, because I don't publish those as regularly as I do my weekly vlogs, which come out on Thursdays. In addition to storing my root crops, I also store many items in the 2 freezers that I happened to purchase once I arrived in Alaska. One I store mainly meats in, and the other one I store my fruits and vegetables in. The Yeti, which is what I use as my refrigerator. And I pack the Yeti with these Arctic ice blocks that I got from Bass Pro. Now these ice blocks are fantastic, as is the Yeti. The ice blocks work so well that if I'm not careful, they'll freeze whatever they come into contact with. So I have to be very cautious about what I set up next to them if I don't want it to freeze. If you don't have a refrigerator and you're thinking about alternative means of refrigerating your food, I do recommend the Yeti. I know they're expensive, but in my opinion, they're worth the cost. But freezers are something that I think are essential to today's way of life. So if you have the means to have a freezer in your cabin, or you have the means of storing your freezer goods outside during the winter months, more power to you, right? You got to do what you got to do. As I mentioned, I don't have appliances in my cabin. And I do have a wood stove, which I do cook upon. If for whatever reason the wood stove was not functioning, I also have a backup means of cooking. I have my butane stove, but the butane stove is one of those things where I have to have cans of butane on hand. Now, I was fortunate enough to be able to find enough butane to be able to supply the butane stove for the entire winter. But I also have a rocket stove. If you're not familiar with what a rocket stove is, it is a stove that takes just small amounts of timber. You can use branches, kindling essentially to fuel the stove, and then it creates a jet stream of flame that comes up through a very small port, and then you use that to heat your food with. And this rocket stove is a Minuteman that I bought years ago, and it works fantastic. So if I needed another source of cooking, I have multiple sources. And so that's one of the other things that I recommend is, again, 1 is none and 2 is 1. Have backups for backups. That is something that I truly believe in, is making sure that you are prepared enough to be able to overcome any situation that you might be handed. I want to thank you for watching this video. Please leave a comment down below. I'd like to know where you're watching from and what you plan on bringing with you to Alaska, or if you're planning on moving somewhere other than Alaska or staying put. I'd like to know that too. I'd like to get to know my viewers. Be sure to check out my other videos. This is the one that YouTube recommends, and this is the one that I recommend.